Greetings, programs. Welcome to Rationality, From AI to Zombies, Chapter 48, The Proper Use of Humility. It is widely recognized that good science requires some kind of humility. What sort of humility is more controversial. Consider the creationist who says, "But who can really know whether evolution is correct? It's just a theory. You should be more humble and open-minded." Is this humility? The creationist practices a very selective underconfidence, refusing to integrate massive weights of evidence in favour of a conclusion that they find uncomfortable. I would say that whether you call this humility or not, it's the wrong step in the dance. What about the engineer who humbly designs fail-safe mechanisms into machinery, even though they are damn sure the machinery won't fail? This seems like a good kind of humility to me. Historically, it's not unheard of for an engineer to be damn sure a new machine won't fail, and then it fails anyway. What about the student who humbly double-checks the answers on their math test? Again, I'd categorise that as good humility. What about a student who says, "Well, no matter how many times I check, I can't ever be certain my test answers are correct, and therefore doesn't check even once"? Even if this choice stems from an emotion similar to the emotion felt by the previous student, it is less wise. You suggest studying harder, and the student replies, "No, it wouldn't work for me. I'm not one of the smart kids like you. Nay, one so lowly as myself can hope for no better lot." This is social modesty, not humility. It has to do with regulating status in the tribe, rather than scientific process. If you ask someone to be more humble, by default they'll associate the words to social modesty, which is an intuitive, everyday, ancestrally relevant concept. Scientific humility is a more recent and rarefied invention and is not inherently social. Scientific humility is something you would practice even if you're alone in a spacesuit, light years from Earth with no one watching. Or even if you received an absolute guarantee that no one would ever criticize you again, no matter what you said or thought of yourself, you'd still double check your calculations if you were wise. The student says, "But I've seen other students double check their answers and they still turned out to be wrong." Or what if, by the problem of induction, 2 plus 2 equals 5 this time around? No matter what I do, I won't be sure of myself. It sounds very profound and very modest, but it is not coincident that the student wants to hand in the test quickly, go home and play video games. The end of an era in physics does not always announce itself with thunder and trumpets. More often it begins with what seems like a small flaw. But because physicists have this arrogant idea that the model should work all the time, not just most of the time, they follow up on small flaws. Usually, the small flaw goes away under closer inspection. Rarely, the flaw widens to the point where it blows up the whole theory. Therefore, it is written, "If you do not seek perfection, you will halt before taking your first steps." But think on the social audacity of trying to be right all the time. I seriously suspect that if science claimed that evolutionary theory is true most of the time, but not all of the time, or if science considered that maybe on some days the Earth is flat, but who really knows, then scientists would have better social reputations. Science would be viewed as less confrontational, because we wouldn't have to argue with people who say the Earth is flat. There would be room for compromise. When you argue a whole lot, people look upon you as confrontational. If you repeatedly refuse to compromise, it's even worse. Consider it as a question of tribal status. Scientists have certainly earned some extra status in exchange for such socially useful tools such as medicine and cell phones, but the social status does not justify their insistence that only scientific ideas on evolution be taught in public schools. Priests also have high social status after all. Scientists are getting above themselves. They want a little status, and now they think they're chiefs of the whole tribe. They ought to be more humble and compromise a little. Many people seem to possess rather hazy views of rationalist humility. It is dangerous to have a prescriptive principle in which you only vaguely comprehend. Your mental picture may have so many degrees of freedom that it can adapt to justify almost any deed. Where people have vague mental models that can be used to argue anything, they usually end up believing whatever they started out wanting to believe. This is so convenient that people are often reluctant to give up on vagueness. But the purpose of our ethics is to move us, not to be moved by us. Humility is a virtue that is often misunderstood. It doesn't mean we should discard the concept of humility, but we should be careful using it. It may help to look at the actions recommended by a humble line of thinking, and ask, does acting this way make you stronger or weaker? If you think about the problem of induction as applied to a bridge that needs to stay up, it may sound reasonable to conclude that nothing is certain no matter what precautions are employed. But if you consider the real-world difference between adding a few extra cables and shrugging, it seems clear enough what makes the stronger bridge. The vast majority of appeals that I witness to rationalist humility are excuses to shrug. The one who buys lottery tickets saying, but you can't know that I'll lose. The one who disbelieves in evolution saying, but you can't prove to me that it's true. The one who refuses to confront a difficult-looking problem saying, it's probably too hard to solve. The problem is motivated skepticism, aka disconfirmation bias. More heavily scrutinizing assertions that we don't want to believe. Humility, in its most commonly misunderstood form, is a general excuse not to believe something, since, after all, you can't be sure. Beware of fully general excuses. A further problem is that humility is all too easy to profess. Dennett, in Breaking the Spell, Religion as a Natural Phenomenon, points out that while many religious assertions are very hard to believe, it is easy for people to believe that they ought to believe them. Dennett terms this belief in belief. What would it mean to really assume, to really believe that 3 is equal to 1? It's a lot easier to believe that you should, somehow, believe that 3 equals 1, and to make this response at the appropriate points in church. Dennett suggests that much religious belief should be studied as religious profession. What people think they should believe, and what they know they ought to say. It is all too easy to meet every counter-argument by saying, well, of course I could be wrong. Then, having dutifully genuflected in the direction of modesty, having made the requirement obeisance, you can then go about your way without having to change a thing. The temptation is always to claim the most points with the least effort. The temptation is to carefully integrate all incoming news in a way that lets us change our beliefs, and above all, our actions, as little as possible. John Kenneth Galbraith said, faced with the choice of changing one's mind and proving that there is no need to do so, almost everybody gets busy on the proof. And the greater the inconvenience of changing one's mind, the more effort people will expend on the proof. But if you're going to do the same thing anyway, there's no point going to such incredible lengths to rationalize it. Often I have witnessed people encountering new information, apparently accepting it, and then carefully explaining why they're going to do exactly the same thing they planned to do previously, but with a different justification. The point of thinking is to shape our plans. If you're going to keep the same plans anyway, why bother going to all that work to justify it? When you encounter new information, the hard part is to update, to react, rather than just letting the information disappear down a black hole. And humility, properly understood, makes a wonderful black hole. All you have to do is admit you could be wrong. Therefore, it is written, to be humble is to take specific actions in anticipation of your own errors. To confess your fallibility and then do nothing about it is not humble, it is a boasting of your modesty. Here ends chapter 38. Now for my thoughts. Right, well this is one of the more self-explanatory ones. This is one of the ones that really goes over and explains itself, rather than throwing more complicated concepts at you, which you then have to puzzle through. This one's a sort of a nice clearing up, I find. But it does make a good distinction between doing humble and professing to be humble, which is quite a good point. And as it said towards the end, it's a lot easier to say stuff than it is to actually do anything about it. And it's a very common thing I found. And one of the things I have found is that, as discussed, people tend to examine very closely anything that is counter to the beliefs, looking for problems. This is something I have found. And so I, as a general rule, tend to try to look hardest at the things I want to believe. Basically, if you want to believe X, there is a good chance that what you are trying to get yourself to believe, or what you desire to believe is true, is not in fact true. And that a rational person if they found themselves wanting to believe in whatever the thing was, would become suspicious and would ideally spend at least as much time, if not more time, examining the foundations of that belief that they want to believe more closely to make sure that what they actually wanted to believe was in fact true. So, for example, if you found yourself instinctively believing that your local sports ball team were the best at playing sport ball, then maybe, rather than critically analysing their competitive teams and saying, hey, these guys are no good, maybe you should actually look at your local sports ball team and see if they really are actually the best. And if so, what did you mean by the best? That's another common one. However, there is a downside with this. If you go into a group or a new area or whatever, and you find yourself thinking, this looks cool, this fits with my preconceptions, I want to believe it, and then, like a sensible person, you start asking penetrating questions to find out if the thing that you are now subscribing to, or if the thing that you now want to believe, really is as good as people have told you, then often they will mistake you for an ideological enemy and start throwing things at you, which can be a bit of a problem. And also keep in mind, this rationality stuff, it's not what everybody else is doing. So even though you can explain, hey, look, I want to believe X, same as you guys do, but I also don't like being wrong. So I want to make damn sure that what I'm telling other people is true really is true. That's not a common thing. And so even when you tell people, hey, this is what I'm doing, they often won't believe you, or maybe they'll believe you on an intellectual level, but not an emotional one. So that's just something to keep an eye on. It might be very scientifically rigorous, but as was mentioned right at the start of this, it's likely to annoy people. Anyway, that's all for this one. Now, this was a reasonably long one, so I probably won't do 2 this time. I'm a bit short on time at the moment. So, bye for now. Greetings, programs. Welcome to Rationality, from AI to Zombies, Chapter 48, The Proper Use of Humility.